Hi everyone, I'm Rick Beato. In today's Everything Music, we're going to spotlight a mixer named Andy Wallace. I wanted to start with Andy because he's a very fascinating and incredibly talented mixer. That's today on Everything Music. Okay, so who is Andy Wallace? You're probably really familiar with a lot of his work if you listen to heavy rock. I'm going to give you a list of some of his records that he did. He first started showing up in the early 80s. You'd start seeing his name on records as an engineer. One of his first big records was Rain in Blood, a Slayer record in 1986. Then you start to see in 1987, he mixed the Run DMC Aerosmith song Walk This Way, the remake that Rick Rubin produced. And that was kind of his first really big record. Engineer and mixing Electric, The Cult, South of Heaven Slayer, and then the early 90s. And in 1991, he mixed a record called Nevermind. This is what catapulted him into national prominence, the Nevermind record, which was such a massively big record. The record was originally mixed by Butch Vig. From everything I know, the label wanted to get a dedicated mixer, essentially. It really started in the early 80s with guys like Bob Clearmountain, who are fantastic mixers. The idea of a dedicated mixer really came to prominence in the 90s. Pretty much every record that was on a major label was produced by one person and mixed by another one, with the exception of records by Brendan O'Brien, but there's an interesting exception to that related to Andy Wallace. I'm going to list some of the bands that he mixed and some of the records. Sepultura, Screaming Trees, Sweet Oblivion, Social Distortion, Somewhere Between Heaven and Hell, which was a great record. 1992, he mixed the first Rage Against the Machine record, which is a fantastic sounding record. It was produced by Garth Richardson. You've got Helmet Meantime, which was a really powerful, heavy record of its time, 1992. Then we go down, we've got Soul Asylum, Grave Dancers Union. Once again, a huge, huge hit record with a lot of radio singles. And then in 1994, Andy not only mixed and engineered, but produced Jeff Buckley's record, Grace. Blind Melon Soup, Toadies, Faith No More, Ricochet, Cracker, Rush, Screaming Trees, Rage Against the Machine, Evil Empire, 1996. That particular record was not produced by Garth, but was produced by Brendan O'Brien. The amazing thing about it is that it's the only record that I know of that Brendan O'Brien did not mix himself, that he produced. Disturbed, he did their big hit record with Sickness on it. Bands like At the Drive-In, he mixed that. I know he mixed One Arm Scissors. And then as we get into the 2000s, he starts mixing all the big rock records. Linkin Park, the first two records he mixed. Oleander, Puddle of Mud, Slipknot, Toadies, Stained, Chevelle, and this just keeps going on and on and on. Disturbed, Blink-182, A Perfect Circle, 13th Step, Andy mixed that record. Thrice, you name it, Rob Zombie, Shinedown, Leave a Whisper, and it just keeps going on and on. What I'd like to do now is do a bit of an analysis of Andy's mixing style. What kinds of effects he uses, what kinds of EQ he uses. I'll give you some good examples here that you'll be able to tell for yourself exactly what's happening. So let's get into this. Okay. There's been a lot of talk on whether Andy uses samples or not. He talks about it in interviews that he's done, which amount to about one. That was in 2005 that was on Mix Magazine Online, where he talked about using samples. He said he uses samples to trigger ambience. Now, that is true to a certain degree. A lot of mixers will use samples to trigger ambiences, and here's the reason why. When you're working on rock music and you're trying to isolate the snare, many times when the drummer's playing in the chorus of a song, they're hitting the hi-hat really loudly, and then the cymbal wash from the hi-hat gets into the snare mic. If you put reverb on that reverb will have all the high end of the cymbal wash. So what do? Well, what he does and what most mixers do is they heavily gate it so there's just a little bit of a click of the snare, and then they put a sample in, and the sample will go to a reverb. So the sample is a clean shot. Back then in 1992, the way people would use samples, they'd use an AMS sampler that would trigger based off whatever you were using. Sometimes you'd have to record a trigger track on a separate empty track on the tape. Nowadays, you use plugins called Trigger, for example. There's a Steven Slate plugin, or There's drum replacement plugins from Massey. There's many types of different drum replacement. A lot of people do it with MIDI now as well, where you create a MIDI track based on your kick and snare or toms or whatever you're doing, and then you use drum samples and trigger it that way. But this is the early 90s or so into the early 2000s. So I'm going to play you a series of mixes here back to back. I've cut them out and put them together. And I want to see if you can recognize what you're hearing. Yeah. Okay, how many of you noticed that the kick and snare are very similar from song to song? We went from Rage Against the Machine to Puddle of Mud to back to Rage Against the Machine to Jeff Buckley to Stained to Linkin Park, I believe, and Chevelle. Not exactly in that order, but listen again to the kick and snare. I'm going to play it again for you. Yeah. If I just play the first two pieces there, you should be able to tell, even on the camera, with the sound from the camera, and I'm going to include sound clips of this. For those of you that are my Patreon supporters, I'm going to have the MP3s of these available on my Patreon site, along with samples that I've put together that are very similar to Andy's. So anyways, check out the kick drum and the snare sound on the first two songs here. Yeah. Well, the kick is identical between the two. There's no question about that. That is the same kick drum sample. The snare is slightly different. Now, the thing about snare is that you have snare in your overheads. The tuning of the snare is going to affect the snare sound because he doesn't completely take the snare out. He heavily gates it where it's just a t, t, t. And when there are snare fills, he'll ride the sample snare down and so that you'll actually hear the articulation. And sometimes he'll automate the gate where the snare's not quite as gated, where it's more open to keep the length of the snare there. But for the most part, what you're hearing on the snare is you're hearing the sample over the sound of the snare. The sample has ambience built into the sample because he has a type of white noise that is put on the end of the sample. So it sounds to me like a drum machine clap or gunshot sound with a white noise tail. He'll use EQ to tune it to the particular track, but you also have to account for the tuning of the snare and for the snare and the overheads. But he tends to keep the overheads way down, and he even said this in his interview, and will ride the overheads up on the cymbal crashes. He'll do a pass of the song and do automation, ride up the cymbal crashes, ride them back down, ride up, ride down. In that way, he can control the ambience of the mix and can focus the snare sound. The kick here is a direct replacement. There's no question about it. Listen again. It has reverb on it. Now listen to the snare. Listen to the snare when I go from this song to this song here. The snare is identical. Listen again. If you listen to 3 songs in a row, listen to the snare. The only difference is the amount of reverb that's on them. That is the same snare sample. It's pretty much the same snare sample on all these tracks. Whether it's the same kick or not, we're going to talk about in a minute here. But this kick right here on People Under the Sun. Yeah. And this. That's the identical kick. There's no question about that. Let's talk about how he's using these samples. Here is an example of Rage Against the Machine. That's the snare track, heavily gated. Okay, listen again. And here it is in the next part of the song. Listen. You notice the gate is opening slightly before the snare. Let's listen to the kick drum. Listen to the gate of it. Once again, it has a little bit of a suck into it each time. Here it is again. Here's the kick and the snare. They're heavily gated. Listen. Here's a snare sample I made. Again, listen. It's like a drum machine sound from the 80s that has white noise behind it. You can make a sample like this and actually put white noise behind it and make a long tail. What Andy would do is take that sample and put it into a reverb and give it more length and then tune that white noise to the pitch of the track. So let me go in. Let me play you this sample here. Listen to the sample here. Now I want you to listen to this. Yeah. Listen. Yeah. Listen to this kick. Listen to this snare. Listen to this. Listen to this kick. Listen to the snare. Listen to this. Yeah. Now, since you have the actual real kick and snare mixed in with those samples, it gives it a little bit more beef, okay? It's not a complete replacement. There is the really gated kick and snare in there. And the reason for this is it gives it the feel and it doesn't sound like a machine gun when it's triggering really fast. So when he goes into a section where there's a fast snare fill, he'll duck down the sample so you hear the real snare, the gated snare, playing the dynamics of the fill, so you get the pitch variation of the snare hits. Okay, so it's kind of a dance that you play around with automation. Andy's not the only person that does this. Every big mixer does this. Okay, let's listen to a little loop from a Linkin Park song with the kick and snare. Listen to this. Now listen to this kick and snare. Okay, now let's listen to this here. You'll notice as I transition from this Linkin Park song to the Chevelle song, listen to the kick and snare. The snare and kick are indistinguishable. Listen again. The only difference is the ambience on the snare. Linkin Park has more ambience on it. Now listen to this snare here. Then listen to this. Listen to this. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to go between them now, okay? Listen to the snare here. Listen to this kick drum here. Listen to this kick drum. So what you should notice is that the kick and snare between these two songs are identical, essentially. The only variance you're hearing is in the close mic of the gated snare that you're hearing a variation in pitch. You're also hearing the tuning of the white noise in the sample that gives it its specific sound. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is Andy's bass sounds. One of the hallmark signatures of his sound is the chorused bass. Andy's using the SPX90 Mark II, which I have right over here, program number 15 called Symphonic. It's a pitch change, flanging, chorusing kind of sound. If you'll notice, when you listen to the bass sounds of his mixes, they're always chorused or flanged. It's not obvious immediately, but that chorusing gives it a movement and a stereo sound to it. I'm going to play you the beginning of a Chevelle bass sound, but I can play you any of Andy's bass sounds, and they're all going to have this chorus on it. Listen to this first opening of the Chevelle song here. Okay, that is a chorused bass sound. There's no question about it. You can hear it if you're thinking about it and you know what a chorus bass sound is, you recognize it instantly. The program 15 is an old school way of chorusing anything. You can chorus the bass, you can chorus the vocals. You will hear it on a lot of his recordings. You'll hear it on the Come As You Are guitar by Nirvana. You'll hear it in vocals. You'll begin to recognize it if you own one of these. I've had one of these forever. And that program 15 was a very common chorusing program in the day. It's just the preset setting. There's no adjustment to it at all. Now, I've mimicked that bass here. I replayed that part. That's definitely sounds like an Ernie Ball bass to me. I've played the part. My strings are a little bit deader, so it's not identical. That's me playing the exact same part on my Ernie Ball bass. Now I'm going to put the SPX90 on with it. Listen. Let me go back to theirs, to his. Back to mine. Back to his. One of the difference in the two sounds is in my performance, I don't have as much pick scrape. That bass had brighter strings than mine, and he's playing with the side of the pick. That's what's giving that scraping sound to it and giving it a really uniquely percussive effect. That's in the performance. I tried to mimic that, but my strings weren't quite bright enough. I needed to change my strings before I did it. But that's the sound right there. Now, if I isolate the SPX90, this is what it sounds like by itself. This is simply the SPX90. Listen. It's a really heavy chorus, actually, and it's very dirty. That's the thing about having these old pieces of gear from the 80s. Now, you can pick up an SPX90 on eBay for $120, maybe less even now. I'm not sure if they're going to be in good repair or not, but you can find ones that are working. They've got great reverb programs on there. You'll see people like Joe Barisi, who's a great mixer, that says he uses one of the room sounds for his snare drum. That's kind of like his standard sound that he uses. So they can really be used. It's an inexpensive piece of gear that you can find because they made millions of them. You can find anywhere. And if you want that bass sound, you can get it with that. Here's another example of a song that Andy mixed. You can hear the chorusing and the bass if you listen closely.
It's been a while since I first saw you. It's been a while since I first saw you.
You can also hear the bass very clearly here. You can hear it here. Very obvious. What it does, it gives movement from side to side. You can hear it here too. it gives it a side-to-side move. Anytime you put something in stereo like that, it makes it less boring sounding. And he's doing it to create movement like that in the speaker. By widening the bass, it makes your mix sound much wider as well. Well, in guitars, it's another thing. He really has very aggressive sounding guitars. Most of the records that he mixes are recorded by great engineers. So they just come with great sounds. There is no scrambling around to try and make a bad track sound good. So you're already starting off with great sounds. But where he decides to EQ them is really in a particular place. Now I'm going to play a couple clips of a few different bands. I'm going to go from Linkin Park to Chevelle to Rage Against the Machine guitar sounds. And I'll just play them back to back for you. The first one is a Linkin Park track off the second record, Meteora. The second one is a Chevelle track off Wonder What's Next. And the third is Rage Against the Machine, Killing in the Name of. Now, what do you notice from that? You notice that they're really aggressive sounding guitars. There's a lot of 3K in them. 3K is that frequency that goes out and grabs you. If there's too much of it, it becomes incredibly fatiguing and shrill to the ear. But having just the right amount is crucial to making your guitars sound aggressive. Now, some of the guitars, depending on the track, will have reverb on them or they'll have a delay on them. It really kind of depends. Very few mixers will mix distorted guitars dry. The Rage guitars are very dry. That's a stylistic choice in that. But most of the guitars that Andy will mix will have some type of reverb or delay on them. A lot of mixers, when they're mixing heavy guitars, will put an eighth note delay that has a little bit of repeating to it so that the guitars, especially when there's chops in the song, don't sound like they go to dead silence. It actually gives the guitar some air and some breathing room. You can do it with reverb, or you can do it with delay. Delay tends to be a bit cleaner than the reverb does. You get a lot of buildup of frequencies in reverb, and you get a lot of high-end, unwanted high-end information, but reverb can sound incredibly good. A lot of old-school guitars like Eddie Van Halen, if you listen to the first Van Halen record, which we will analyze at one point, the main guitar is in the left speaker, and the reverb is in the right speaker. And the reverb is done afterwards in the studio. So that's a very common thing, to use reverb on electric distorted guitars. Okay, next we're going to talk about Andy's treatment of vocals. Now, vocals are really particular and can vary from song to song. But there are general concepts that he uses. I'm going to play an example of In Bloom by Nirvana. I'll solo the vocal track and see if you can hear some of the effects that are being used.
Sell the kids for food. Well, the change.
You can hear the chorus on it.
Spring's here again. Reproductive glands.
So that chorusing effect can either be gotten through the same Program 15 symphonic on the SPX 90, or it can be gotten from the very few pieces of outboard gear that Andy uses. He only uses a few. One of the ways you can tell what he uses is, in the old days, 10 years ago, you could go to Soundtrack's website into Studio G where he worked, and it had a gear list. And you had pictures, and you could see what gear was in there. You had a Lexicon 480L, you had a couple PCM 42 delays, you had a PCM 70 reverb, you had some DBX 902 gates, you had a couple other odd pieces of gear. I think there was a couple 1073s. I don't think Andy ever uses. Anything that I've read, he doesn't use really any outboard gear other than effects. And he had the XPS 90 version 2, which I happen to have right over here. So you can hear the chorusing on the voice. I'm going to go to the background vocals of Dave Grohl here so you can hear that. Okay. Now these are all double tracked, as are the lead vocals. This has nothing to do with the mixing part. That was a production choice by Butch Vig and is a production choice on many rock records. There's very few rock records or pop records that don't have vocal doubling, especially in the choruses. And just a little aside here, if you solo the bass track, chorused, very obviously chorused as well. Thank you for watching as always. Please subscribe here and on my Everything Music Facebook page if you haven't already. And please check us out on Patreon at the link provided. The high-res files and the Pro Tools sessions are available through my Patreon page. Follow the link provided below. Thank you. I'm Rick Beato.